Montana Territory, 1883. The gate was iron and old, and it groaned when a man touched it, which Eli Voss thought was either a warning or a welcome, depending on what kind of man you were. He had been standing outside it for approximately 4 minutes. He knew this because he had counted. Counting things was what Eli did when his mind was working faster than the rest of him had agreed to. He was 26 years old. He owned a horse named Cora, a saddle that had belonged to his father, $14 in a tobacco tin under his bunk, and one good shirt, which he was wearing. He had worn it Monday. Today was Wednesday. He had told himself this meant nothing. This was not entirely convincing. The Holt homestead sat back from the road behind a long stretch of pale grass that had gone silver in the October cold. The mountains behind it stacked up against a steel blue sky, like they had been placed there specifically to make a man feel the appropriate size. Which was small, which was honest. Eli had spent enough time in Montana to know the land did not flatter anyone, and he respected it for that. Cora shifted her weight behind him and exhaled through her nose with a sound that contained, in Eli's estimation, a measurable amount of judgment. "I know," he said. She did not respond, which was its own kind of response. He had practiced what he meant to say. He had practiced it Tuesday night on the ceiling of his bunk room and again this morning on the road, and he had arrived at something that was honest without being pathetic, which was the balance he was going for. He wanted to speak to George Holt. He had a thing he intended to say to George Holt. What happened after that was George Holt's business, and Eli had made his peace with that, mostly. Though his boots told a different story. He had cleaned them twice that morning. He had cleaned them again at the creek crossing on the way here. The creek crossing was 2 miles back. This was the kind of detail a man noticed about himself when he was being honest. He was trying to be honest. George Holt was not a man who inspired ease. He was 61 years old, built like something the land had decided to keep, with a jaw that had apparently never received instruction on how to soften and eyes the particular grey of creek water in November. He had homesteaded this land before Eli was born, had wintered it alone twice in the early years, had buried a son and kept going, and wore all of this the way a mountain wears weather, not as tragedy, not as pride, just as the plain fact of what had happened and what he had done about it. He did not say much. When he did say something, it tended to land with the specific weight of a thing that had been thought about for a long time before being given air. Eli was not afraid of him exactly. He was the appropriate amount of something adjacent to afraid, which was respect with its hat off. He opened the gate. It groaned, as it had always groaned, and Cora followed him through without being asked, because Cora had been down this road before, literally 4 times in the last 2 months, though Eli had categorized each of those visits under reasonable and necessary and not the real reason, which was the real reason, and she knew where they were going. She had opinions about where they were going. She expressed these opinions through the quality of her footsteps, which today were the footsteps of an animal who wished to register a concern, but had committed to seeing this through anyway. The house came into full view as the road curved, and Eli felt the thing in his chest that he had stopped pretending wasn't there. It was a farmhouse, white once, and weathered now to the color of an overcast afternoon, with a long porch running the front of it, and a kitchen window that caught the morning light in a way that made the whole structure look like it was paying quiet attention. There was a step stool on the porch, small, 3-stepped, worn smooth at the top edge from years of use. He had noticed it the first day he came here, 4 months ago, and he had noticed it every time since. And he was not going to think about why he noticed it, except that he always did. Clara Holt was not on the porch. He told himself this was fine. He was not here about Clara Holt. He was here about a conversation with George Holt that had nothing to do with Clara Holt, except that it had entirely to do with Clara Holt, which was the exact shape of the problem he had been living inside for the better part of this autumn. She was 5 feet even on her tallest day, which she would tell you herself before you got any ideas about remarking on it. With dark hair, she kept practical and eyes that did the thing eyes do in a face that has learned to wait for people to show you who they are before deciding what to think of them. She was 22. She ran the house accounts, helped her mother with the kitchen garden, could read a weather change 2 days out by the way the grass moved, and had, on the occasion of their first meeting, told Eli exactly how to fix a broken wagon wheel in a tone that suggested she had fixed several and found the process self-explanatory. He had fixed the wheel. He had done it correctly. She had handed him a cloth to wipe his hands and thanked him without sentiment. And he had ridden home and stared at the ceiling for an amount of time he was not going to put a number on. George Holt had said to him once in passing, in the flat tone of a man stating weather, "No man's going to come for a short girl when there's tall ones to be had." He had said it without cruelty. That was almost the harder part. He had said it the way a man says a thing he believes to be true about the world, a thing the world has taught him, and that he had accepted the way you accept hard winters, not happily, but without argument, because arguing with weather has never once changed it. Eli had said nothing at the time. He had nodded in the way a person nods when they are recording something for later consideration, tucked it away and ridden home. He had considered it at length over the following weeks, and had arrived at a conclusion that was simple and firm, and somewhat surprising to him in its clarity. George Holt was wrong, not wrong about the world. The world had its opinions, and the world was not always incorrect, but wrong about this, wrong about her, and wrong, though Eli was only now understanding this fully, about what a man comes for when he comes at all. He tied Cora to the post at the edge of the yard, and she leaned her head slightly to the left, in the manner of an animal noting that she had been through this before, and had opinions about how it had gone the last several times. And Eli put his hand briefly on her neck and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that she didn't already know. He walked to the front door. He knocked. From inside the house came the sound of movement, unhurried and certain, and then the door opened, and Ruth Holt was standing there with a dish towel in her hands and an expression on her face that was not surprise. It was the opposite of surprise. It was the expression of a woman who had been expecting this particular knock on this particular morning for several weeks, and had simply been waiting for the young man outside to arrive at the conclusion she had reached some time ago. She looked at him. He looked at her. "Coffee's on," she said. She stepped back to let him in, and as he crossed the threshold, Eli saw the kitchen and the window and the pale October light coming through it, and then he saw Clara at the far end of the room, turned toward the stove, who had not yet heard him come in. Then something in his chest went very still, the way things go still before they change. He did not know, yet that Ruth Holt had told her daughter he was coming. He did not know, yet that Clara had been up since before dawn. He would understand it later, much later. He would laugh about it quietly, the way a man laughs about something that embarrassed him once and now just makes him glad. But that was later. Right now, he took off his hat and he waited, and the coffee was already hot. 4 months earlier, a wagon wheel introduced them. This was not romantic. The wheel had cracked clean through the left spoke assembly on the rutted stretch of road that ran past the Holt property's eastern edge, and the wagon had listed sideways into the ditch with the quiet dignity of something that had been waiting for permission to give up. Eli had come upon it at dusk, riding back from the mill, and had stopped because stopping was the only thing a man with any sense did when he saw a wagon in a ditch and a lantern burning beside it. The lantern was being held by a woman standing on a boulder. She was holding it high and steady, and she was studying the wheel with the focused expression of someone who has already diagnosed the problem and is now simply waiting for the situation to catch up with her conclusions. She did not look distressed. She looked, if anything, mildly inconvenienced. The way a person looks when something has gone wrong that they fully intend to correct. Eli dismounted and said, "Evening." She looked at him the way a person looks when they have already decided whether to trust someone and are simply confirming the decision. "Spokes cracked through," she said. "Left side. You'll need to pull the axle pin before you try to lift it, or you'll split the hub." He looked at the wheel. She was correct on all counts. "Eli Voss," he said. "Clara Holt," she said, and handed him the lantern. He fixed the wheel. It took 19 minutes. She held the light exactly where it needed to be without being told. And when he asked for the wrench from the wagon bed, she had it in his hand before he finished the sentence. And when the axle pin gave way with a sound like a small argument being settled, she did not flinch. She simply shifted her weight on the boulder and waited for the next step. He found himself working more carefully than the situation required. He also found himself not examining why. When it was done, she climbed down from the boulder and looked at the wheel with the brief nod of a woman confirming what she already expected. Then looked at him with something that was not quite a smile but lived in the same neighborhood. "Thank you," she said. The words were plain and complete. There was no performance in them. He rode home in the blue October dark and did not think about her, specifically, except that he thought about her the entire way, which he categorized as simply the natural result of an unusual evening and not a pattern. It was a pattern. He returned to the Holt property 3 days later with the specific and legitimate purpose of returning a wrench he had accidentally placed in his saddlebag when packing up. This was true. The wrench was real. He had also had the wrench for 3 days without noticing, which was either an accident or evidence of something he wasn't prepared to name yet. He tied Cora at the post and knocked at the door and was greeted by Ruth Holt, who was Clara's mother and who opened the door with the expression of a woman who had been expecting him since approximately Tuesday. Ruth Holt was small and precise, with silver-threaded hair and the kind of quiet that is not emptiness but the opposite, a quiet that contains a great deal and releases it only when it chooses. She had warm grey eyes that missed nothing, and she moved through her kitchen the way a conductor moves through a familiar piece. Economically, certainly, already 3 measures ahead. She took the wrench from Eli, thanked him, told him Clara was in the garden, and mentioned that coffee was on, all in the same even tone, as though these were simply facts about the world he might find useful. He stayed 45 minutes. He told himself he was being polite. Clara was pulling the last of the autumn squash from the garden when he came around the side of the house, and she looked up without surprise in the manner of someone who had been informed he was coming, though no one had told her exactly, because Ruth Holt worked in methods that did not require announcement. They talked for a while about nothing of particular consequence. The early cold, the state of the eastern road, whether the mill was likely to raise its grinding fee before spring, and it was easy in the specific way that easy things sometimes are when neither person is trying. He stood with his hands in his pockets. She crouched in the dirt with her sleeves rolled and pulled vegetables from the ground with the efficient calm of someone who has been doing this since she could reach. At one point, she stood to move to the next row, and she was short enough that the top of her head came to his collarbone, and she glanced up at him without any particular expression and said, "Hand me that basket," and he handed it to her. And neither of them said anything about the height of anything, because there was nothing to say about it. He noticed the step stool again on his way out, propped now against the kitchen wall just inside the back door, worn smooth at the top from years of daily use. He did not comment on it. He simply saw it and filed it away in the part of his mind that was collecting things about her without his permission. Ruth watched him ride away from the kitchen window. She had her coffee cup in both hands, the way she held it when she was thinking about something that pleased her. George came in from the barn, caught the look on her face, and said, "What?" "Nothing," Ruth said, in the tone that meant the opposite of nothing. George looked out the window at the road where Eli's horse was disappearing into the tree line. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "He's got nothing to speak of. $20 and a horse if he's lucky." "You had a mule and $4, Ruth said pleasantly. She did not look at him when she said it. George had nothing to say to this, which was accurate, and sat down at the table with the expression of a man who has been outmaneuvered by someone who is not even competing. He picked up his coffee. He drank it. He did not bring up Eli Voss again that evening, but later, when the house was quiet and the fire had gone low, he stood at the kitchen window for a long moment in the dark, looking out at the road. He was not thinking about the young man, he would have said, if anyone had asked him. He was simply looking at the road. The step stool was still propped against the wall behind him. He looked at it for a moment without moving. Then he went to bed, and he did not say anything to anyone. And he did not need to, because Ruth had already seen his face from across the room, and Ruth had already understood, and Ruth Holt had not been wrong. About a person since 1861, she was not wrong now. November arrived in Montana the way it always did, and without apology. The cold came down from the northern passes and settled into the valley like a landlord who intended to stay through April, and the grass went from silver to iron, and the creek along the Holt property's southern edge filmed over at the edges each morning in a thin crust of ice that the afternoon sun didn't always bother to undo. It was the kind of cold that clarified things. A man found out what he was made of in a Montana November, not because the cold was testing him, but because it simply removed everything that wasn't essential, the way wind removes loose things. And what was left was what was actually there. What was left in Eli Voss, it turned out, was a persistent and increasingly creative need to ride past the Holt property. He had, by his own private count, found 11 distinct reasons to travel the Eastern Road in the 6 weeks since the wagon wheel. There was the matter of the Delaney fence that needed a second opinion on its post alignment, the Delaney property being approximately a quarter-mile past the Holt gate, which meant passing it twice. There was the question of whether the mill road had flooded at the low crossing, which required investigation every few days, apparently, given the variability of the situation. There was a morning in late November when he rode past on the stated basis that he was checking the condition of the road after a frost, which was a thing no one had ever needed to check on in the history of Montana roads, and Cora had expressed her view on this through the specific method of slowing to a near stop as they passed the Holt gate and requiring active encouragement to continue. He had encouraged her. She had complied. She had done so with the energy of an animal completing an obligation rather than a choice. He stopped on the 4th visit. He told himself it was the smoke from the chimney that made him think they might need something. Clara opened the door before he knocked. She looked at him for a moment with the calm expression of a woman standing in a doorway on a cold morning who has seen a man invent a reason to be somewhere approximately 4 times and has decided to let him find his way to the truth on his own schedule. Then she stepped back and said, "Coffee's on," because that was apparently what the women in this house said, and Eli came in, and they sat at the kitchen table while Ruth moved quietly at the stove, and they talked for an hour about things that were not the thing they were talking about. It was on his 6th visit that Clara named it. They were on the porch. The afternoon light was the particular flat silver of a December sky that has decided not to commit to anything, and Clara was mending a piece of harness leather with the focused attention she gave to everything her hands did, and Eli was leaning against the porch post with a coffee cup and what he believed was a casual expression. He had mentioned in the course of the conversation that he had been in the area because of the eastern fence line, which needed looking at. Clara did not look up from the leather. "Which fence?" she said. "The eastern one," Eli said. "Along the ridge." Clara said. She made 2 more stitches. Then she said, "That fence belongs to the Alderman property. They sold it in September. Nobody's run cattle on that line since August." A silence of considerable quality settled over the porch. "I may have meant the other one," Eli said. "There isn't another one," Clara said, in the tone of a woman who knows exactly where every fence within 4 miles of her home is located, which she did because she had helped build 3 of them. She looked up at him then, and her expression was not unkind. It was simply clear, the way creek water is clear when it runs over pale stone, and you can see directly to the bottom without any distortion. She held his gaze for a moment, then looked back at her work. She did not say anything else. She did not need to. The silence said the rest, and it said it with more precision than words would have managed. Eli drank his coffee. His ears were warm in the cold air. He came back the following Thursday. Ruth had engineered this, though no one could have proven it in a court of law. She had mentioned to Eli's employer, a rancher named Caldwell, that the Holt property could use an extra pair of hands for the wood splitting before the deep freeze, and Caldwell had mentioned it to Eli in the tone of a man passing along useful information, and Eli had appeared at the Holt gate the following morning with an axe and a Tuesday expression on his face, which was the expression of a man who has received a gift and is pretending he found it on the road. George had put him to work without ceremony and paid him fair, and at noon Ruth had brought lunch to the yard and set it on the porch steps, and Clara had come out with the coffee, and they had all sat in the pale winter light together, and it had been so ordinary and so complete that Eli had felt something settle in his chest that he didn't have a word, for it was in that same week that Daniel Pruitt came calling. He was the second son of a prosperous spread to the north, With new boots and a father who had already spoken to George Holt at the feed store about the subject of intentions, which was a thing Daniel Pruitt's father did on his son's behalf, apparently, the way some men clear the road before the wagon. Daniel was tall and pleasant, and arrived on a Sunday with his hat in his hands, and an ease about him that came from a life in which most things had worked out reasonably well. He sat on the Holt porch for an hour. Clara was polite. She offered him coffee. She answered his questions. She was, by every external measure, perfectly courteous. She did not get the step stool to reach the high shelf where the good coffee cups were kept. She used the everyday ones without ceremony and did not explain the choice, and no one remarked on it. And it was possible that no one noticed. Eli noticed. He had been splitting wood at the far end of the yard, which was within eyeline of the porch if a man happened to be looking in that direction, which Eli happened to be doing with some regularity. He watched Daniel Pruitt smile at something Clara said. He split a piece of wood with slightly more conviction than the wood required. He counted fence posts on the way home. He got to 37 and lost count, and started again. He did not sleep particularly well that night, and in the morning he lay in the blue-grey dark of the bunkroom and made a decision that had been forming since October, since a wagon wheel in a ditch, since a woman on a boulder holding a lantern steady and telling him exactly what needed to be done. He was going to speak to George Holt. The only question was whether he had anything worth saying when he got there. George Holt was splitting wood when Eli came. Through the gate, he did not stop. He set the next piece on the block, brought the axe down with the economy of a man who has done a thing 10,000 times and sees no reason to perform it, and split it clean. Then he set another. He had seen Eli coming up the road from a distance, and had made the decision to continue splitting wood, because a man who puts down his axe for every visitor gives the impression that visitors are an event, and George Holt did not intend to give that impression. Eli tied Cora at the post and walked across the yard and stopped at a respectful distance and said, "Mr. Holt, I'd like a word if you have one to spare." George split another piece. Then he set the axe against the block and turned, and looked at Eli the way he looked at everything, with the grey, patient attention of a man who has learned that most situations reveal themselves if you give them enough silence to work with. "Speak," he said. Eli spoke. He had practiced this as established, and what came out was close to what he had intended, which was more than most men managed when standing in front of George Holt with something real to say. He said he had been coming around the property for several months. He said he was aware that this had not gone unnoticed. He said he had not come to make promises he couldn't back with something real, and so he was not going to make promises. He was going to make a statement of fact, which was that he intended to court Clara Holt with her father's knowledge and her own willingness, and he wanted to know if George Holt had an objection he needed to hear. He stopped talking. The yard was quiet. A jay called once from the tree line, and then thought better of it. George looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, "What do you have?" Eli had known this question was coming. He answered it without dressing it up. He had $14. He had a horse that was sound and a saddle that was his. He had a job with Caldwell that paid fair, and would pay through spring. He had a name he had not wasted, which was not nothing. And he had, he said, the intention to build something worth building on ground that would take the work. He was 26. He was not finished. George said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "No man's going to come for a short girl when there's tall ones to be had." It landed the same way it had landed the first time Eli heard it, not as cruelty, but as something harder than cruelty to argue with, which was a man's settled and weathered belief in how the world worked. Eli looked at him steadily. "I came," Eli said. "That's what I have to say about that." George studied him. The moment held. Then George turned and picked up the axe and set another piece of wood on the block. And Eli thought for one long second that this was the end of it, that he was being dismissed the way weather dismisses a plan, and his stomach went to the ground floor. Then George said, without turning, "Winter the place. Full season. No word from me about Clara in either direction. You show up, you work. Nothing owed to you and nothing promised. You do that, and in the spring we talk." Eli said yes before the sentence was finished. George looked at him over his shoulder. Something moved briefly across his face, that was not quite approval but lived close to it. "Don't say yes like it's easy," he said. "It isn't. I know," Eli said. "Yes, anyway." George split the wood. He did not say anything else. Eli understood this meant the conversation was over, and the agreement was made, and he walked back to Cora and untied her, and was halfway to the gate when George Holt spoke again, and what he said stopped Eli where he stood. 31 years ago, George said, a man gave me the same terms. His voice was flat, the way it always was, but there was something beneath the flatness, something that had been carried a long time. "I had less than you." "I had nothing, honest. I failed the first winter. Couldn't hold the work, couldn't hold my temper. Walked off in February when it got hard." Eli turned. George was looking at the mountains. "Came back in the fall," George said. "Went to her father. Told him I'd failed and I knew it, and I was asking for the winter again." Old man looked at me for a long time. He paused. "He gave it to me. The yard was very quiet. Her name was Ruth," George said. He picked up another piece of wood. She waited. She didn't have to. She knew what I'd done, and she waited anyway, and I have not once in 31 years been worth what that cost her to do. His jaw moved. "I'm telling you this so you understand what the winter is for. It is not for me. It is not so I can measure you. It is so you can find out what you do when nothing is owed to you and nobody's watching." He brought the axe down. "The wood split perfectly. Now go," he said. Eli went. He walked to the gate, and his hand was on the iron latch, cold and solid beneath his palm, and his chest was so full of something he did not have a name for that he stood there for a moment, just breathing the sharp December air and letting the mountains be as large as they were. Then he heard it, a sound from the side of the barn, small and quick, the sound of someone shifting their weight on frozen ground, the sound of someone who had been very still for a long time and had just decided to move. He did not turn around. He knew that sound. He knew it the way you know the sounds of a place you have been paying close attention to for months. He knew the particular quality of her stillness and the way it broke when something moved her. And he knew, without turning, that Clara Holt had been standing at the corner of the barn for a considerable portion of the conversation he had just had with her father. He also knew, without needing to confirm it, that she had not been there by accident. She had come out to listen. She had always been going to listen. He opened the gate, and it groaned, and he walked through it, and behind him the yard was quiet, and somewhere around the corner of the barn, a woman stood in the cold December light, with her arms folded against the chill, and an expression on her face that nobody saw. And it was not the expression of someone who had just learned something new. It was the expression of someone who had just heard out loud what she had already known, confirmed at last in the plain words of a plain man standing in a cold yard with $14 and a sound horse and a name he had not wasted. It was enough. It had always been enough. The spring came the way it always did in Montana, slowly, then all at once. The ice on the creek broke in March with a sound like a conversation ending, and the pale grass came back green beneath the silver, and the mountains lost their hardest white by April, and Eli Voss worked every day of that winter without missing one. He did not miss one because of Clara, and he did not miss one because of George, and he did not miss one because of the $14 that had become $30 by February through the compound interest of showing up. He missed none of them because of himself, which was the point, and which was the thing he understood fully only when. The last frost broke and he was still there, and had always intended to be. George Holt came to find him in April. He found him mending fence on the eastern line, a real fence this time, one that genuinely needed attention, and stood beside him for a while without speaking, in the way of a man who has something to say and is locating the right words with the care of someone who does not use them carelessly. Eli kept working. He had learned over the winter that George Holt's silences were not empty. They were load-bearing. "Spring," George said finally. "Yes, sir," Eli said. George looked at the mountains for a moment. Then he said, "You did the winter." "I did," Eli said. Another silence. A long one. The good kind. "Come to supper Thursday," George said. He turned and walked back toward the house without waiting for an answer, because the answer was not in question, and both of them knew it. And George Holt did not wait for answers that were already given. Eli watched him go, Then he drove the next post and did not smile exactly. But something in his face did something adjacent to it that Cora, tied to the fence line nearby, observed with the quiet satisfaction of an animal whose opinions had been correct all along. They were married in June, so on the Holt property, in the long, cool light of a Montana morning that was the color of pale water and clear sky. Ruth cried once, briefly, and then composed herself with the efficiency of a woman who had held things together through harder things than happiness and saw no reason to come apart now. George did not cry. George stood very straight and shook Eli's hand after, and held it a moment longer than a handshake required, and said nothing, and that nothing contained everything he knew how to mean. The step-stool moved with Clara to the small house Eli built on the parcel of land he bought the following year. A clean quarter-mile from the Holt homestead, close enough that the smoke from both chimneys was visible from either porch on a still morning. It lived in the kitchen, where it had always lived, worn smooth at the top edge from years of daily use, and it served its purpose without ceremony, which was all it had ever been asked to do. Their daughter was born in the spring of 1885. They named her May, for the month and for the light and for no formal reason that George ever admitted to. She had Clara's eyes and Eli's patience, and an opinion about most things that she expressed early and often, which surprised no one who knew either of her parents. George Holt held her on the porch the afternoon she came home. He sat in the chair he always sat in, the one with the worn armrests, and Ruth put May in his arms. And something happened to George Holt's face that his face had apparently been capable of all along, and had simply been waiting for the right occasion. It went quiet and soft and entirely unguarded, the way a landscape looks after a long rain, and he looked down at that small face with the expression of a man encountering something that has rearranged everything. He thought he knew about the order of importance of things. Eli saw it from the doorway. Clara saw it from beside him. Ruth saw it from the kitchen window, where she always saw everything, and she turned back to what she was doing without saying a word, and the expression on her face was the expression she had worn since 1852, which was the expression of a woman who has been right about people her entire life and has made her peace with the fact that they always find out on their own schedule. Nobody said anything. So about George's face, this was the correct choice. Some things are witnessed and not named, because naming them would make them smaller, and they deserve to stay exactly as large as they are. That is what this story was about, if you want the plain truth of it. Not height, not money, not what a father says in a hard moment when he is trying to protect something he loves by telling it the worst version of what the world might do with it. It was about what a man does when nothing is owed to him. It was about what a woman already knows while she is waiting for everyone else to say it out loud. And it was about a step-stool on a porch in Montana that never meant anything except that a person found a way to reach what she needed, and kept reaching, and never once apologized for it. Character is what you are before anyone is watching. Eli Voss went into that winter with $14 and came out with nothing he didn't already have. And that turned out to be exactly enough. It always had been. If you made it to the end of this story, thank you, truly, from the bottom of my heart. These stories exist because of you. Every comment, every like, every share with someone you love, that is what keeps this going. Wherever you are today, in the United States, in Australia, in Canada, in the United Kingdom, in Ireland, in New Zealand, in Pakistan, I hope this story gave you something warm to carry. May God bless each and every one of you who listened today. Until next time, keep riding.